The physical can affect your emotional, certainly. And the physical can also just weaken you so much that you can be open to more attacks from the enemy, the devil, in spiritual warfare. So you can take any one of these, physical to the other three, the emotional to the other three, the spiritual to the other three, or the deliverance to the other three. I choose to take the second avenue, the psychological. I don't know, maybe I'm prejudiced because my background of 12 years of teaching psychology and psychopathology, that I find that I can reach the spiritual components and the physical components most directly by that means. So I'm not saying that's the only way, because everyone who conducts Healing of Memories programs, and there have been many of them, even Ruth Carter Stapleton, the sister of President Carter, conducted her own form of the Healing of Memories, even had a retreat house just for that purpose. And you got Francis McNutt, and you have the Lynn brothers, and all. Each have their own method of doing the Healing of Memories. My particular method is through the psychological. So let's look at the mind first of all and see how the mind correlates with the body, and then we can move into the spiritual. Let's start with the psychological as affecting the body, physical. Okay. Dr. James Henry, who was a professor of physiology at the USC, University of Southern California, found that there were two patterns of emotions. Now, first of all, there are 27 emotions. Some of them are very good, like love, peace, joy, hope. These are very positive things, and as you see in the book of Proverbs, where it speaks so many times about this, they're very integrative. These things will make you healthy. How good sense of humor, a merry heart makes for good health and all that. That they're positive emotions will integrate and build up. They're good for you. It's good to have love. It's good to have hope. It's good to have peace. These emotions are really very, very helpful. But there are about 12 or 13 of those 27 emotions which are not helpful. These are negative emotions, and they're sometimes helpful because they prevent danger. For instance, if you didn't have fear, a negative emotion, you wouldn't get off the track when the train's coming, or get out of the way of the raging bull running after you or something. If you didn't have anger, you could never be a reformist and reform things, or have political ideals if you didn't have anger at abuses in the political system, for instance. So these negative emotions serve a good purpose in themselves. But, and here's the point that Dr. Henry formulated, when these things have an undue arousal or a prolonged arousal, the negative emotions begin to produce very deleterious effects. They destroy the body as well as the mind. Now, looking at just the negative emotions, because we're dealing with healing, so we don't talk about the good emotions, those are great, but we're dealing with what has caused the damage. Let's look at these negative emotions. They fit in two categories. There are the passive negative emotions, such as grief, or guilt, or despair, or feelings of loss, or feelings of failure, especially if you lost a job, especially a man that's lost a job and feels like he's a failure as a provider for his family or something. A woman that has a divorce feels like a failure because she couldn't hold on to her husband or something. These are negative emotions, a broken-hearted syndrome, that you see being explored so much now with the use of phenylethylamine drugs and things of that sort. So these are negative emotions that are passive. Now, these passive negative emotions are registered in a part of the brain called the hippocampus. It's very important to remember these are different parts of the brain, because I'm going to show you as we go through this what the Bible says about how we find counterpart emotions with counterpart therapies. These are found in the hippocampus of the brain, and they activate part of the body called in case you're interested in scientific thing, it's the pituitary adrenal cortical network. Produces cortisol, which is a hormone, very powerful hormone, which is good, but if it's overused, if it's overproduced, it's terrible. It causes terrible things, including loss of memory. Persons that have under a lot of stress have an outpouring of cortisol, and their memory will fail them very rapidly. Anyway, this is in the adrenal glands of the cortex. That's the outside. The cortex means the outside of the adrenal gland. Now, the other negative emotions are registered in a different part of the brain. These are the active, aggressive emotions, and they're in the amygdala part of the brain. These emotions are things like anger, hatred, bitterness, resentment, impatience, or a sense of threat to oneself or one's family in crime-ridden situations and so on, or a threat to loss of income, a fear of losing a job or something, where you have to fight to get it, or something like that. These are aggressive types of emotions. And these are in the amygdala. Now we got two different focal points of two different types of sets. These are what they call the antinomasic emotions. These are pyramids, as it were. And the peak of each of these pyramids are the two emotions of guilt, that's the passive, and hurt, responding to hurt, which is anger, resentment, bitterness. All these negative emotions fit into those two, under those two headings, or antinomasic emotions. For instance, if you have rheumatoid arthritis, it's an autoimmune disease. The body is allergic to itself in a sense. Or myasthenia gravis, or something where the body attacks itself that way. The whole immune mechanism is thrown out of kilter. And that's usually caused by those, triggered by, not caused, triggered by those passive negative emotions. Whereas the active negative emotions will trigger things like the catecholamines, one form of which is adrenaline, causes the heart rate to go up and causes the blood pressure to go up and things like that. It causes increase of fatty acids in the blood, which are called triglycerides. And the whole cardiovascular system begins to be overactivated and begins to wear out. So we end up with heart problems. So we have two major areas. One that tends to lead toward, ultimately, in the general direction of passively triggered emotions, which is cancer, mainly. And then the actively triggered emotions, which is cardiovascular problems, such as angina pectoris, or a myocardial infarction, which is a heart attack, or high blood pressure, something like that. If you are over 44 years old, past the young age where most death comes from a variety of diseases or trauma or suicide, over 44 years old, it's almost certain that you will die either of heart attack or cancer, one of the two. If you're over 44, the vast majority of deaths after that age fit in one of those two categories. Of course, we know now that heart is the most serious cause of death, the most frequent cause of death today. We don't know how long it's going to be that way. It's going down. But cancer is second. And cancer is going up in women, especially women who smoke. It's increasing rapidly these days. But those are the two major things. Now, those fit in those two, the emotions that trigger, not cause, but trigger those two things are exactly the same emotions that are found in the amygdala and the hippocampus, which trigger the adrenal responses, the hormones, which tear down the body, the immune system of the body, so it can't defend itself. And by the way, some of these sort of go together, like, for instance, persons who have allergies will be more prone to having cancer. Some of these things will go in what they call syndromes, or constellations of symptoms. If a person has excessive passive emotions, they would tend toward having cancer, be disposed for that. For those who have excessive aggressive emotions, these are the ones that most frequently have the heart problems. Now, a truly healthy person is between those two extremes. A truly healthy person does not have a long arousal of negative active emotions or a sustained arousal of negative passive emotion. That is, doesn't hold a lot of resentment and bitterness and hatred and so on. They're clear of all that. And secondly, they're clear of all guilt and failure and feeling of unworthiness and all that sort of thing. When they're free of those two things, then they're in the middle. They'll live much longer. When a person has a setback in life, everyone experiences occasional setback, losses or threats, losing a job or losing a person by death in the family, bereavement, and so on. Why do some people sail through these episodes of life, these setbacks, these events, and others just fall apart? According to Dr. Stretner, as he mentioned, the R factor, which is resistance to stress, they have a high R factor threshold. Some have a resistance to stress, and they get through this very well. Some do not have a good resistance to stress, and they just break up under it. In an earthquake or an accident or something, just go. Now, effective coping with life situations, involves the capacity to maintain a psychological equilibrium. In psychology, it's called homeostasis, the homeostatic or keeping level the emotion between the two extremes of those two antinomastic emotions we talked about. I'm going to show you how this fits in the Bible, because the Bible says the same thing in biblical phraseology, of course, not in medical phraseology. Anyway, a study was done in Alameda County in California, 7,000 people, and they found that they asked them, do you have good social life? You belong to a church and you feel accepted by a prayer group or a church or something. How about your family? Do your wife or husband accept you and you feel warm receptivity when you walk in your house at night from work or whatever? You know, you have good, warm friends, a lot of friends. The people really appreciate you and they call on you and they admire you and so on. Do you have bonds of friendship, bonds of family love especially? Do you have bonds of happiness in relationships, social relationships? And they put these persons in two categories. Ones that they counted to the extreme poor, unhappy marriages and isolated people and couldn't get it. They just don't have friends. And the other ones, the ones that really just were really happy with their social life. They had really good relations in their home and their family, their work. Everyone liked them. And they compared these two groups of people, 7,000 of them in this one study. And they found out that the ones who didn't have the happy home life and church life and all this, who weren't really fulfilled socially, had 10 times as much arthritis as the other group. 10 times. Clearly you can see that the mind affects the body. This is just one of hundreds and thousands, really thousands of studies, research. In Michigan, I'm going to be there in a few weeks now. In Michigan, they did a study with auto workers, and they measured the ones that had supportive home life, supportive work, and the social life, and they got the same conclusions. And so the mortality rate, by the way, was much higher in those that were unhappy in their social relations. In any given day, more of those people died than the other group. Then they did a beautiful study in Johns Hopkins Medical Center that covered 30 years, which is a really good survey over a 30-year period of doctors. They just kept track of these doctors. And the doctors that that grew up from childhood in a close family relationships, these were stricken with cancer far less than those who didn't have those good family relationships.
This is the other side. One
of doctors. They just kept track of these doctors. And the doctors that that grew up from childhood in a close family relationships, these were stricken with cancer far less than those who didn't have those good family relationships. So the cancer itself is far more common in families that are unhappy or dysfunctional families than the others. Dr. Caroline Bedell Thomas, she's the head of the Johns Hopkins study of this. She says, anyone who does not believe that emotions and disease are linked is ill-informed. So we want to ask Jesus to heal our emotions, not just to heal our arthritis, but the emotions that trigger that. Not just to heal our diabetes, but the emotions that cause that to flare up. Not just to heal our high blood pressure, but the emotions that cause that. Not just to heal the spastic colitis. Heal all of the things at the root cause. Dr. Carl Simonton from Fort Worth, Texas, and his wife, who's also an oncologist and cancer specialist, wrote that book, Getting Well Soon, How to Heal Yourself of Cancer. And he had a study, psychobiological profile of these people, and he found that persons who have cancer have 2 or 3 characteristics most frequently. First, an insecure childhood of some kind, some insecurity in their childhood, plus the some kind of love deprivation, a sense of loss. They've lost a pet who was killed or died. They lost money in the stock market. They lost a job. They lost a son or child that left the church. They lost money. They lost a heirloom. They lost money, not winning the lottery after putting thousands into it, whatever, you know. They lost, a sense of loss or a fear of loss, a fear of losing a job, not just losing a job, but fear of losing a job. That plus the insecure childhood have a very high cancer rate, very high cancer rate. Here again, you got the psychobiological profile. Now, these are fuzzy. There's no real clear definition of these things. There's a lot of exceptions, you know, and all that. These are just general statistical overviews. But when he treats these people with ideogenetic types of therapy, where they train their mind to think in certain ways to attack those cancer cells, especially children, marvelous things. And especially in men with testicular cancer, the amazing things they can do with the mind to cure this cancer. It's unbelievable. Certain types of cancer especially. Showing again that the mind that can cause the disorder can be the mind that can cure that disorder too. Again, the interfunctioning between the interactivity between the mind and the body, which is why we want to have holistic medicine, holistic healing. But we don't want to stop there. We want to bring in the spirit. So hold on to this in the back. This is just the first step. Among women who have what they call gynecological cancer, the 6 forms of gynecological cancer, like cervical cancer and so on, these all have one type of personality. There's a totally different type of personality for those who have, say, the 3 forms of skin cancer, melanoma, basal, and those kind of squamous cell. They have a different type of personality. But the cancer for women in the female organs, that usually fits a very clear type of personality. And they found in 180 women in the Sloan Kettering Institute for Cancer that they were usually a stoical type of person, sometimes very affable and very polite, but kind of rigid emotionally, didn't cry easily and so on, a rigid denial and so on. So it's a matter of learning how to live with your emotions. Very, very important. If you deny that these problems exist, and so many people do deny that, just like that's the most common symptom of an alcoholic, of course, famous denial syndrome. Everyone else knows he or she is an alcoholic. That person doesn't know it. Oh, I drink a little too much, but I'm not a drunk. I'm not an alcoholic now. Denial. You can't have any kind of rehabilitation at all if you get over that denial. That's the first thing. But you get a lot of other cases besides. It's clear in alcoholism, every case of alcoholic has a denial syndrome. But at the beginning especially, in the pre-alcoholic state they don't, but in the pre-alcoholic personality, when it moves into the alcoholic personality, then it changes. The neurotransmitters of the brain change, and they begin to have that little pocket of insanity of denial. They deny reality, that they have an addiction. You can have a lot. What is very clear in alcoholism is true, but less clear in some other things, such as the denial that you have an emotional problem, denial that you have inhibitions in love and marriage, denial that you lack love, and yet maybe as a man perhaps you cannot really tell your wife that you love her dearly. You cannot have what St. Paul calls in Colossians 3:13 tender-hearted love. If you deny that you are truly love expressive, you can't be healed. These denial things can just truncate the whole process of therapeutics. You really have to face the reality, which requires absolute humility to say, I have this problem. Not evade it, and not evade the healing of it. The saying, well, I know our marriage is not the happiest in the world, but it's your problem. You go get the therapy. I don't need it. That is the most stupid type of thing, making it a personal problem when it's clearly interpersonal. That's one of the lowest levels of immaturity for a person to say something like that. But there's a lot of people who do it. They can't face reality. So there's no hope for people like that who can't get over the barrier of human pride. And pride is really common here. Those persons, it's a brick wall. You just can't help them. So we want to really be able to clear the decks of this whole thing so that what we're going to deal with in this next couple of days is going to require a lot of very intensive introspection and a lot of real gut-level honesty. Look at that mirror and see yourself. Really look at yourself in the full components of your personhood. Now, there's a lot of talk these days about dysfunctional families. According to probably the greatest expert, John Bradshaw, probably 96% of all families in the United States are dysfunctional. 96% have a relational problem in the families. The characteristic of a dysfunctional family is codependency, and that's a broad term that covers a lot of things here. Let's backtrack for a moment. Not getting into a particular thing like alcoholism, but 30 million alcoholics in the United States are 30 million children of alcoholics who have had alcoholic parents who damaged their personality. The COA, the Children of Alcoholics. That's a whole organization by itself. But these become dysfunctional because they either themselves become addicted to alcohol or addicted to drugs or addicted to food, gluttony, overeating, and so on. Destructive relationships, overwork, workaholics types, Compulsive types of activities, all kinds of compulsive activities are dysfunctional things. They may be prone to depression, anxieties, phobias, fears, and psychosomatic illnesses, stress-related difficulties, many aspects of their lives. They have trouble dealing with trust and control, responsibility and guilt and intimacy. They just can't relate intimately, you know. Like the woman that told her husband, "Gee, you never kiss me anymore." You know, look at that young couple that moved in next door. When he goes to work every morning, he stands on his front porch and kisses his wife passionately. Now, why don't you do that? He says, "Well, for one thing, I hardly even know that woman." But anyway, a lot of people cannot see their own inadequacy. They can't face it. So the healing, this healing prayer we're going through is going to provide empowerment to face that for those who are humble enough to go along with it, because you can be very passive and just listen and be what we call a thumb twiddler who says, "Well, let's see what he's going to do for me. I'm going to be passive and see if he's going to heal me by what he says." Well, it won't work that way, that's for sure. But this inner child that we have, this inner child that hasn't really grown up yet, never allowed to grow up and develop because it's been truncated, fixated by all kinds of pressures, and especially the general term they use now, shame. Shame is a big term that means more than what the dictionary says. But it's just a sense of unworthiness, a sense of unfulfillment, of not receiving enough love, and therefore not being able to give. Well, the 6 principles of psychology of love, the first one is the law of reciprocity, which is mentioned by St. John, by the way, in 1 John 4:18. Why should we love God? Because God has first loved us. It's reciprocal. We got to reciprocate. So a baby can never learn to love anyone else if that baby hasn't been loved first. So anyone who's been love cheated in life, and we'll talk about this tomorrow in a great extent, anyone who's been love deprived cannot be a good love giver, so they won't be a good marriage partner usually. When a person has been cheated, they can't express love. That's why Shakespeare says, "He does not truly love who does not express love." I was given a charismatic mass for 1,000 people one time, and some lady who had never been to a charismatic mass before came back in the sacristy after mass, and she says, "Oh, Father, that was so beautiful. I'd never seen this before. Those charismatics," those charismatics, she says, they were hugging each other and hugging me, and people came up to me, total strangers, saying, "I love you in Christ." It was just so beautiful to have all that love going on. I just came back to tell you how happy I am. And I said, "Well, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it." She turned and went out of the sacristy. Another lady came in right after her, and she says, "Father, that kiss of peace, that sign of peace, that hugging, wasn't that disgusting? Ew. Total strangers came up and hugged me. Ew." Now, the one person found this delightful, and the other person found it absolutely repulsive. Why? Why did one find it delightful and one repulsive? If you go back in the childhood of those women, you'd find that one was raised in a loving home out of hugging and kissing, real warmth, and the other was raised as a cold fish. So they're going to have very limited ways of expressing their affection, if at all. They'll be very poor at communicating love. So this is the background of love deprivation, which we'll talk about more in extent tomorrow, but that's dysfunctionality. That's dysfunctionality. 96% of our families have some form, and the many forms of dysfunctionality. Just quickly, I'll give you a summary. There are four categories of these various roles. By the way, Bradshaw listed 58 types of behavior patterns, but since that time, a couple of years ago, he's added a lot more. It must be up near 100 now. Different patterns, you know, like the enabler and the squelcher and the class comic and all this. These different types of personalities that are dysfunctional. He has reduced to four categories. There's the hero type that takes over whatever has to be done for the family just to keep it together, becomes the enabler, you know, that takes over for the alcoholic father or mother that can't, and making excuses for them, all that sort of thing. There's kind of a caretaker, a perfectionist, or the saint of the family, you know, that always does things right. The surrogate spouse, the child is appreciated by the mother or father because it can't get it from the spouse. The second category is a scapegoat, and that's the one that becomes a real problem child, the rebel, the nonconformist, the antisocial one, acts out the anger in the family, blamed for all the problems in the family. The third is the lost child, and that's the one that withdraws from the family, becomes a silent one, the loner, and it doesn't give problems to anyone, but it isn't involved either. So there's a lot of passivity there. And then the fourth is the mascot type of personality, the one that becomes the family clown, the entertainer, the one who gives comic relief for the rest of the family. These are all four major categories of dysfunctional types of personalities. And somewhere a common denominator of all of these is this thing they call shame. And not, again, it's a very broad term, shame. It's not what we usually think it is. It's just simply a total feeling of inferiority, unworthiness, and so on. A feeling of being not lovable, not loved, not worthy. It's very closely associated with feelings of guilt. Shame and guilt are very cognate. A dysfunctional family then is described as any family which is either addictive or compulsive or abusive or violent in its behavior, that it's dominant, or has repressive, rigid rules, or one that crushes the human spirit of the child or whatever, or where children are physically or emotionally abandoned, or whatever. There's all kinds. Now, we come back to a love problem here. No one can give too much love. No one can get enough. No one can give enough love. No one can receive too much love. Or the over-permissive love, do whatever you want, and ends up a spoiled brat. Those are two forms of pseudo-love. They're not real love. Real love, you cannot give enough. There's no way you can give enough, no way you can receive enough. That's another subject we'll talk about tomorrow. But prayer alone will usually not heal adult children of dysfunctional families. You here are adults. Prayer alone won't do it because there's certain preconditions. Jesus said, for instance, go show yourself to the priest. Now, you put a condition there. You're not going to be healed of this leprosy until you fulfill the law of Moses. Go and show some kind of sincerity by going through the rituals, etc. Or go wash in the pool of Siloam or something. Jesus always conditions certain things, So the prayer itself, people saying, well, I got a problem, I'll just pray and they'll be healed. Well, it usually doesn't work. Sometimes it does, but usually it won't work. Things have to be worked out by oneself. This is where this cooperation is needed. So isn't it's prayer, certainly, but the old saying, pray sailor, but row for shore. You've got to do your part, You ask God to do his part, but you've got to do your part. And this is what we're here for today, is to show how we can do our part to dispose ourselves for some miraculous healing when God steps in and does his part. If we go show ourselves to the priest, if we go wash in the pool of Siloam, we go taking steps of psychoanalytic self-evaluation and so on, then we can do something. So you have to be worked out before you can really accept healing, especially permanent healing. So there's a program that we have to go through. I'll just give you a quick survey of this because I don't want to keep you here all night. First, there has to be surrender. That is, overcoming denial, that denial of pride and so on. Embracing involves a certain pain. This, what we're going to go through, is painful tomorrow and the next day. Second, there has to be a socialization and honest sharing of your feelings with significant others, being able to communicate. You can't bottle this stuff up in yourself. You have to communicate. You have to speak. You have to break the no-talk rule. Share your secrets. You can't heal what you don't reveal. And the 12-step program, by the way, is excellent format for that. It's a good structure for that. The third thing is self-disclosure. We have to get in touch with the inner child. Really get in touch with that. Get in touch with the unresolved grief, the fact that you never had a chance to develop the way you needed to for some reason. You have to externalize your feelings of abandonment, and not to blame anyone or project your problems on anyone. It's simply to uncover how you really felt so that you can face and have these feelings dealt with. But then you don't heal it by yourself. You have to call on Jesus to do it. You can't do it yourself. But that predisposition for the prayer of healing is very, very important. Most people don't realize that. They approach this whole thing kind of simplistically, which means they haven't studied their scriptures very carefully, because you look at Old and New Testament healings, there's predisposition for those healings. And usually. The fourth is self-talk. That is, you have to externalize the voices in your head, so to speak. You have to become more and more aware of these shaming voices. What are you telling yourself constantly? I'm overweight. I'm ugly. I'm not appreciated. I'm afraid I'm going to make a mistake. What do people think of me when they look at me or hear me? This self-talk. You've got to get these voices from within that have been talking to you, even inarticulately, and get them out and affirm. Need affirmations of self-love. Love thy neighbor as thyself. 8 times the Bible uses that phrase, as thyself. Spirituality is the last one. You have to learn to prayer, meditate, to create an inner place of silence where we're really centered and grounded in God. Psalm 46:10, be still and know that I am God. You need that stillness. Experience shows us that this healing is absolutely impossible without some inner guidance. And this kind of healing we're going into, this is very sophisticated healing. It gets really down to the root cause that's never touched by any antibiotics or surgery or anything. Without that inner guidance, that uplifted consciousness, grace-activated consciousness that takes us beyond ourselves. That's where God comes into the picture. And he's ready to come in right now. He's ready to act. You know, in the 51 countries I've been in, I've seen a lot of miracles. I've seen 12 people cured of blindness, 6 of them instantly, usually in this Healing of Memories program. I've seen people cured of paralysis, terminal cancer. I've had marriages on the verge of divorce turned into honeymoons, second honeymoons overnight. I know the power of God. He wants to work. He can work. We got to give him a chance to work. But I've also seen many persons that I know, just by psychological perspicacity, I can tell there are people that come right to the edge of a miracle and don't get over it. They come within an inch of getting a real miracle and never get it because they do not cooperate fully. There's still an element of pride, denial in there. They don't fully cooperate and they miss their miracle. They could be cured of alcoholism or anything else and they miss it. They don't go all the way with total. When the ones that do go all the way, we get remarkable cures of homosexuality, for instance, which is a very intractable disorder. It's a dystonic personality.